She was left alone on a date, until a billionaire stranger said he'll regret losing you. Before we begin the story, don't forget to follow Tender Bonds, like and share our story. The cold that January had been the kind that didn't announce itself. It settled in low under the doors, through the cracked caulk around the kitchen window Silas kept meaning to reseal, and it made the farmhouse on Route 9 feel like a place that was slowly being returned to the elements. He noticed it most in the mornings, when he came downstairs in his socks and stepped on the linoleum, and felt the floor draw the warmth from him like a debt. Miller's old toolbox sat against the baseboard by the back door, the same place Miller had always put it after a job, the red paint gone to rust at the latch and the hinges brown with it. A rag stuffed through the handle because the handle had cracked 18 months before Miller died, and Miller had said he'd fix it properly when he got around to it and never had. Silas had gotten around to a lot of things since then. The gutters, the split fence post by the south field. He had not gotten around to moving the toolbox. He drove 30 miles into Beaumont that evening because Cass had called and said she needed a ride, and he said sure, and she said she was at the Derrick House on Commerce, which was the steakhouse the oil company men went to on expense accounts, and he said all right. He didn't ask why. He'd learned not to ask why with Cass, had learned it the way you learn most things in rural West Texas, which was by asking and regretting it, and deciding the asking wasn't worth what you got back. The parking lot was mostly trucks. His was indistinguishable from the others except for the crack across the windshield, which had been there so long it felt like a feature. He sat a minute before he went in. The sky above Beaumont was the color of a bruise, that particular dusky purple-gray that came in the hour before full dark in January, and somewhere out on the highway, a semi was pulling away from something, its engine note rising, and then Dopplering off toward Midland, and the sound of it was a sound Silas associated with a whole class of feelings he'd never properly named. He found her in the back booth by the window. She was sitting very straight, the way she sat when she was working hard at being fine, and there were 2 glasses of water on the table, and one of them was on the wrong side and had not been touched, and the place setting opposite her was still rolled in the cloth napkin. She was wearing the green dress he'd seen her in twice before, both times for events that mattered to her, and she had her hair up, and she was looking at her phone with the particular blankness of someone who is not reading what is on the screen. He slid into the booth. She looked up. She said, "You didn't have to come in." "It's cold," he said. She put the phone face down on the table. The waiter came and Silas ordered a coffee, and Cass said she'd have another glass of wine, and the waiter left, and they sat with the table between them and the empty place setting still laid out like a rebuke. "He texted," she said, "2 hours ago." "Okay." "He said he got held up." She said it without affect, the way you say the name of an animal that has died. "Okay," Silas said again. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug the waiter had brought. Outside the window the parking lot sat under its orange sodium lights, and the cold pressed against the glass and left a faint white crescent at the corners. "You want to eat?" She looked at him. "It's a $40 steak." "I know what it is." She was quiet. The restaurant had that particular low murmur, a dozen conversations running under the country station playing from the ceiling speakers, all of it soft enough that you had to lean in to hear the person across from you, which meant that people in places like this were always leaning in slightly, always inclined toward each other by the ambient noise, and Silas had never thought about that before, but he thought about it now. He thought Miller would have said something about that. Miller was the one who noticed things like that. The engineering of intimacy in public places, the way sound and light and furniture arranged people without their knowing it. They ordered. Silas had the chicken fried steak because it was $17 and because it was what he always ordered when he was someplace he didn't belong, a kind of camouflage. Cass ordered the salmon and then changed it to the chicken fried steak too, and he pretended not to notice that, though he noticed it. It was during the meal that the man from the other side of the room stopped at their table. He was in his 60s, deeply tanned in the way of men who have been on the water rather than under the sun, wearing a jacket that cost more than Silas's monthly note on the truck. He had the easy posture of someone who had never had to apologize for taking up space. "Ma'am," he said to Cass, not unkindly, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I've been watching y'all talk for 20 minutes and I just want to say." He paused. He looked at Silas and back at Cass. "Whoever left you here tonight, and I'm guessing someone did, given the extra setting, he'll regret losing you. I just thought someone ought to say it." He nodded at them both and went back to his table. Silas watched him go. Cass was looking at her plate. "Losing me," she said finally, "like I'm a set of keys." He meant well. "He doesn't know me from a hole in the ground." "No," Silas agreed. She picked up her fork. The restaurant noise settled back over them. He thought about what the man had seen from across the room, two people eating, leaning slightly in, talking in the shorthand of people who had been in the same small spaces for a long time. And he thought about how the man had looked at Silas when he said it, that particular glance, not at Cass, at Silas, as if he were addressing the correct party, and something low and unexamined in Silas's chest moved in a way he didn't look at directly. He had known Cass Dreyer for 6 years. He had known her first through Miller, which was how he'd known almost everyone he knew, because Miller had been the kind of man who collected people the way other men collected tools, purposefully, carefully, because he believed they would be useful, and because he found them beautiful in their specific function. Miller had said, when he introduced them at his back porch in the last August before he got sick, "Silas, this is Cass. She fixes irrigation systems, and she'll beat you at gin rummy, and you should be nice to her." Silas had been nice to her. He had been nice to her at the hospital and at the graveside, and at the reception in Miller's house after, when the casseroles were stacked on the counter and Trace and Deb and half of Reeves County were standing around saying the things you say. And Cass had been standing by the back window with a plate she wasn't eating from, looking at the toolbox by the door, and Silas had come to stand beside her because he didn't know what else to do, and because he was very bad at the things you say. She'd said he was going to fix the handle on that. Silas said, "I know." They stood there for a while. That was the beginning of something, though he would not have said so at the time. He would have said he was doing what Miller would have wanted, being what Miller would have wanted him to be for her, which was present, reliable, the kind of man who shows up. He had been telling himself that story for years with the industriousness of a man who needs the work to keep his hands busy. The drive back to her place was 32 miles on a 2-lane that went through 2 small towns and a stretch of nothing in between. The heater in the truck ran a little loud on the driver's side. She sat with her knees turned slightly toward the window and her coat pulled around her, and she watched the fence posts go by in the headlights, that steady pulse of cedar and wire, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then she said, "He's been doing this for 4 months." Silas watched the road. "Not always this obvious," she said. "Sometimes it's just late or tired or a thing came up." She paused. "I keep making room for the thing that came up." "Cass." "I know," she said. "I know what you're going to say." "I'm not going to say anything." "You are. You're going to say it in that way you have where you don't say it." He was quiet. The truck passed through Pico's, its main street dark except for the gas station, a dog trotting along the shoulder with its nose down, purposeful in the cold. Then they were back in the nothing, the flat dark of the Chihuahuan Basin, stars clearer out here than anywhere Silas had ever been except once. A night in New Mexico with Miller the summer they were 26, both of them lying in the bed of the truck outside Carlsbad, too broke to stay anywhere and too young to care. The Milky Way so thick above them it looked solid, something you could step out onto if you weren't careful about the difference between sky and ground. He had not thought about that night in years. He thought about it now because of the stars, and because Cass was sitting beside him in the dark, and because something was becoming true that he had been refusing to let become true for a long time, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that his stubbornness is actually virtue. He dropped her at her house. The porch light was on, she always left it on, a habit that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the way she'd grown up, her mother's voice. You leave a light on so the dark doesn't have the run of the place. He watched her go up the porch steps. She turned at the door, and her face in the porch light was the face of a woman who had been disappointed and was metabolizing it with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. "Thank you," she said, "for the $40 steak." "Chicken fried," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. She went inside. He sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine running. The pipe went 3 weeks later, the last Wednesday of January, 2 in the afternoon on a day that had pushed above freezing for the first time since before Christmas, that false thaw that comes to West Texas sometimes and fools the ground into releasing what it's been holding. The pipe was the copper elbow behind the hot water heater, the one Silas had wrapped in insulation last fall and thought nothing more about. He heard it go from the kitchen, not a burst exactly, more a sudden release, a sound like a held breath finally given up, and when he got to the utility room, the water was already spreading across the floor in a dark fan and climbing up the drywall in a slow bloom. He got the shutoff under the sink. He stood in the inch of water in his socks. The water heater was still ticking, cooling now without its supply, and the water on the floor was very cold, the cold of pipes that have been holding winter in them for months, and it was working up through his socks and into his feet, and Silas stood there and did not think. He did not think because there was nothing to think. There was the water and the shutoff wrench and the phone in his pocket and the child. Joni was 7. She had her father's forehead and her mother's eyes, and she'd been running a fever since Monday that had gone to 102 that morning, and she was upstairs in her bed with the humidifier going and the door cracked, and she called down now, "Silas." "Yeah, Bug. Is something wrong?" "Pipe went, it's okay." A pause, then, "Do you need help?" He looked at the water on the floor. He looked at the toolbox he'd brought in from the truck last fall when he'd done the insulation work, Miller's toolbox, sitting on the shelf above the water heater because that was the handiest place and he'd never moved it back. The rust at the latch, the cracked handle with the rag stuffed through it. He'd been reaching past it for 8 months without seeing it, the way you stop seeing the things that have become part of the structure of your days. "No," he said, "go back to sleep." He called Cass because she was the one who knew plumbing, because she fixed irrigation systems and pipes were pipes, and she was there in 40 minutes with her own truck and her own tools, and she walked in the back door without knocking, which was the way things were between them, and she saw the water and the open utility room, and she did not say anything except "copper elbow." And he said yes, and she got down on her knees in the cold water without being asked. He held the flashlight. She worked. Her hair was pulled back and she had a line of concentration between her brows that he had seen before, many times in many contexts, and her hands on the pipe fitting were competent in the way that watching someone competent at something always is, that ease that is actually the residue of 10,000 hours of unglamorous effort. The water heater was cold now, a dead thing. The hum it always made, that constant low-frequency Silas had stopped noticing years ago, was absent, and the absence of it was loud in a particular way. Joni appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the horses on them that she'd had since she was 5 and that were now 3 inches too short. Her face was flushed, her hair damp at the temples. "I said go back to sleep," Silas said. "I wanted to see," she said. She looked at Cass on the floor. "Hi, Cass." "Hey, Jojo," Cass said without looking up. "Your fever down?" "A little." "Good." She turned the fitting. "You eat anything today?" "Some crackers." "We'll get you some soup when this is done." She said we without thinking about it. Silas noticed that she said it. He did not think it meant anything, or he thought it meant the same thing all their we's had always meant, which was 2 people who had fallen into the habit of proximity, the accidental family that grief assembles from the materials at hand. But Joni had gone back upstairs, and Cass was sitting back on her heels looking at the repair, and Silas was standing in his wet socks looking at the back of her head. And he thought about the man in the restaurant saying, "He'll regret losing you," looking at Silas when he said it. And he thought about Miller on that porch saying you should be nice to her. And he thought about himself standing beside her at the reception looking at the toolbox with the cracked handle, thinking he was doing it for Miller. Thinking he was there in Miller's place. A substitute, a courtesy, a man honoring a dead friend's wishes. He had been at the edge of his own life for a very long time, watching it from the fence line like a trespasser. He had called it independence. He had called it keeping himself from wanting what he couldn't hold. He understood now, standing in half an inch of cold water in a house that smelled like pipe joint compound and Joni's humidifier, and the particular warmth of people who lived together in winter, that he had been wrong about the nature of what he was doing here. He had not stayed for Miller. Cass stood up. She had a streak of joint compound on her forearm. She turned and looked at him, and something in his face must have said the thing he wasn't saying because she went very still. "Silas." He didn't say anything. The heater was dead behind her. The water was cold at his feet. "You've got that look," she said. "What look?" "The one where you're about to say something you've been not saying for a very long time." She crossed her arms, not defensively, like she was bracing. "So say it." He looked at the streak of joint compound on her forearm. He looked at her face, which was tired and guarded, and something else under that, something he recognized because he had put it there, or helped put it there, over 6 years of showing up and not showing up all the way. He thought about the porch light. The filled gas tank he'd found one morning last February when he'd left his truck in her driveway overnight, filled in the way someone fills a tank when they are expressing something for which they haven't the language. He had not examined it. He had thanked her and driven away. "I don't want to be Miller's stand-in anymore," he said. She uncrossed her arms. The word "anymore" hung in the cold utility room. "You think that's what you've been," she said. It was not quite a question. "I think I let myself believe it. Because it was easier. Because if I was doing it for him, I didn't have to be afraid." The refrigerator in the kitchen clicked on. Upstairs, the humidifier put out its steady breath. Cass looked at the floor between them, at the thin gloss of water still standing there, and then she looked up. "Silas," she said, "I haven't thought about Miller in that way in a very long time." She said it quietly, without apology. "I thought you knew that." He had not known that. Or he had known it and refused to know it, which was the thing he was best at. "The man at the restaurant," she said. "He looked at you when he said it." "I know. And you drove home and sat in my driveway for 5 minutes in the dark." He looked at her. "You were watching." "I always watch," she said simply. "That's the whole thing, Silas. That's the whole thing you've been missing." Joni's fever broke that night. By morning she was asking for pancakes and complaining about missing the math test she'd been dreading, which Cass said was a reliable sign of recovery. Silas made the pancakes. Cass sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the Reeves County paper she'd brought in from the porch, and she read it the way she read everything, with total absorption, occasionally saying something from behind it like they're finally paving the lot by the co-op or Trace's boy got second in the regional steer show. And Joni ate 3 pancakes and half of a fourth, and then pushed away from the table, and said she was going to watch TV in the living room. And the kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the water heater doing its work again, the copper elbow behind it clean and sweated and sound. Silas washed the dishes. He was aware of Cass at the table behind him the way you are aware of a source of heat, a directional warmth. He thought about the last 6 years as a sequence of mornings he hadn't let himself be present for, standing at the margin of rooms he'd actually lived in, a ghost in his own continuing life. The thaw had held overnight and the ground outside the kitchen window was brown and soft-looking, winter releasing its grip a little, not all the way, just enough to remind you that release was possible. The light was different this morning. Low-angled, thin, the particular gold of a West Texas January morning that has decided, just briefly, to relent. He dried his hands. He turned around. Cass was looking at him over the top of the newspaper, her mug held in both hands, her eyes doing the thing they did when she was waiting for something she had decided not to push for. He crossed the kitchen. He took the mug gently from her hands and set it on the table, and she let him, and he sat down across from her with the newspaper still open between them, and he put his hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand and held it. In the utility room, the toolbox sat on its shelf, the cracked handle and the rusted latch, the rag stuffed through where Miller's grip had worn the wood through. Silas had taken the tools out of it that morning to fix the pipe, had laid them on the floor in a row, each one used and returned, and when he was done he had put them back. Not because the toolbox was where they lived now, because he had reached in and found what he needed, and the reaching in had been the thing, the ordinary use of it. The unsentimental, continuing use. The paper on the table between them moved in the draft from somewhere. Neither of them spoke. From the living room came the low sound of the television, a cartoon, and Joni's laugh at something, clear and sudden. And then it went quiet, and the house held them in the ordinary way of houses that have been lived in a long time.